Hello, and welcome to the virtual keynote for the Informs 2020 Analytics Conference. I'm Bill Franks, and I'm really excited to have the opportunity today to try out a new format that I've never done before, and I'm sure many of you haven't attended before. So what I'm going to do is walk you through a talk about the ethics of analytics. And this is a topic that has not gotten a ton of attention until the last year or two outside of the narrow area related to consumer privacy for the most part. But the last year or two has seen an explosion in interest in this important area. And what I plan to do today is to provide you a variety of very specific examples of ethics and how they can intersect with your analytics and data science processes. Most importantly, my goal is not to tell you what is and isn't ethical. What I'm hoping to do is to show you a variety of examples that help illustrate what a gray area many of these situations are and how difficult it can be to decide what is or isn't ethical. So I'm more going to challenge your thinking and put forth some scenarios that in some cases may make you almost uncomfortable. But my goal is simply to make you think through the ramifications of some of what we're doing today in the analytics and data science world. So with that, let me go ahead and start the share here real quick. So as we go through this, I want to set a little bit of level setting. First of all, a lot of people think about ethics and so forth related to data as being biased in scores that are produced, whether it be loan applications, whether it be some other type of model. And that's true, but by no means is that the complete story. There's a whole lot of other areas where ethics intersect analytics and data science initiatives, and that's what we're going to talk about today. In fact, you get into things like GDPR, the California legislation that went into place. They're here and they're expanding. But even these laws start to add some really interesting scenarios. So a big component of all these is the right to be forgotten. I can call an organization or email them and say, I want you to stop contacting me and also erase my data. It sounds great, but what about scenarios like, can I call my doctor's office and tell them to delete my medical records? What about an insurance company? Let's say I have a warranty with a given organization that's still in effect. Does that company, by forgetting me then, invalidate the warranty because they don't know anything about me, or are they allowed to keep just enough information to service that warranty until it expires? These are the kind of difficult situations that arise the deeper and deeper we go into these processes. And that's, again, today is going to be what I'm going to try and do, is walk you through a number of examples. And the reality is, it's a much fuzzier line between good and evil data science and use of data. So let's go to a common societal norm. If I was with you live today, I'd actually survey the audience. How many of you would say that killing another person is unethical? Probably everybody would raise their hands, and everyone would say, you know, one-on-one, unequivocally, it's bad, you shouldn't kill people. But then I virtually guarantee almost every single one of you I could get to admit one or more exceptions. So what if I'm in my home, someone breaks in with a gun and appears to be about to shoot me? If I shoot and kill them first, is that okay? Not everyone will say that's okay, but a large percentage of you probably would, maybe 80, 90%. And we get into a scenario, what if I'm in the Army and I'm in an official war zone, there's an enemy firing at me and I fire back at them and kill them first? Is that okay? Now there's conscientious objectors who would say no, they would never participate in that, but probably a wide majority of people would still say that's okay. And we could start to work our way down. At some point, I suggest that my neighbor annoys me making a lot of noise so I can kill them, and almost everyone would say no. The point is, even something that's gone back millennia with every society about you shouldn't kill people, even there we end up with exceptions. So this is why it's so difficult as we get into analytics and data science. So many of these scenarios that seem clear-cut on the surface, as you dig in underneath them, you find they're actually not clear-cut at all. So here's just a generic analytics process flow. Doesn't really matter what's in it. You'll recognize the general gist. So my question here and the premise of this talk is, where in this process are ethics a consideration? I'm going to submit everywhere, across all of this. So I'm going to take you through 5 checkpoints. We're going to start with your model targets or the business problems that you address. This is the first point where ethics come into play. Is the problem that you're targeting actually an ethical problem to target? And does it make sense to even pursue such an analysis? So I'll start with an example that I've always found compelling since it first happened a number of years back. Today we have receipt tape offers that are pretty much ubiquitous. You go to a store, you end up with a bunch of offers at a receipt tape, either at a cash register or in some cases at gas pumps. So back when this was a slightly newer opportunity, I remember talking to a couple of big retailers at the exact point in time about the opportunity to take advantage of this technology, even in absence of a loyalty program. And the way that would work is a lot of people come to the grocery store, for example, over and over and use the same credit card. You can identify that credit card over repeated visits and look at the patterns in the shopping baskets the same as you could with loyalty data. The only difference was with loyalty data, you knew who I was by name and address, etc. If you use the credit card data, it was actually illegal to match it back to me, but you could identify the patterns and then give me offers. In practice, at the receipt tape, the difference would be if it was a loyalty program, they could say, hey, dear Bill, welcome back. Here are some offers. If it happened to be a non-loyalty program, it would simply say, welcome back. Here are some offers. So we talked to two major retailers, name brands that you know, about the ability to do these kind of analytics and what it would take from an analytical perspective, data management, et cetera. They both went back and did some internal deliberation. Company number one came back and said, you know, we think this is great. While we don't have a loyalty program, we're always looking for ways to provide value to our customers. We think they get value from this and they would like it. It stays within bounds. We're all in. The other retailer came back and said, you know, we talked about it. Our lawyers are convinced it's legal, that we absolutely could do this, but we feel like the pact we've made with our customers is that we aren't going to track them in any way. And this, while it's not mapping to them, we feel kind of violates that. And they decided not to proceed. So here you had two organizations, same industry, same point in time, same business condition. They both made polar opposite decisions. So who was right? I'd argue they were both ethical in the sense that they looked at their values, the regulations, and how they wanted to interact with their customers, and they happened to come to different conclusions. That's perfectly okay, but they went through the proper process. And here's the catch, is that you can't simply look at what's legal. Let's go back to one of the most famous examples of a company getting in trouble, which was Target a few years back when they were predicting who was pregnant. I actually know the gentlemen who were in charge of this project, as we were doing some other work from it at the time, and I can promise you the internal pain suffered here was just about as heavy as you might guess. It was not a happy time. Here was the catch. They had a loyalty program, they were collecting data, and they were modeling hundreds of things about customers. That included everything from, might you buy a shirt in the next 30 days? Are you a health food nut? And are you pregnant, based on things being bought? From a legal perspective, 100% what they did was legal. It was exactly within the bounds of the loyalty program. There was no difference from a legal perspective of predicting the pregnancy versus predicting health food issues or lives. Now you get into, is it ethical? Now this is one where, you know, some people might argue it is or isn't. Is it a little too personal? Is it too medical oriented? This one is at least worth the discussion. I'd argue that probably you could say this was ethical in that it fell within the bounds of the loyalty program as laid out. This was one of hundreds and hundreds of factors. Certainly there was no unethical intent. And you would hope that what is legal and what is ethical matched up perfectly, but today that's not true at all. What is ethical is far more stringent than what is legal, in large part because the laws simply haven't caught up. But where we can all agree that it failed here was, what will consumers or customers find acceptable? Clearly, this model failed that test. While it was certainly legal, it was arguably ethical, it was not something that customers accepted, and it caused a lot of pain. So until all of these get in sync, you have to ask all three of these questions. If it's not legal, don't do it at all, period. If it's legal, make sure you think it's ethical, because ethical is tighter than legal. But even at that, you've got to make sure that it's something that will be deemed acceptable. The reality is you ignore any of those questions at your own peril. So another one that's actually a bit timely today is around ethics of censorship algorithms. So there's a big push all of a sudden to censor people on social media proactively. And the criteria for doing that is largely driven by whatever people decide needs censoring. And right now there's a lot of discussion of censorship around health information and COVID-19 opinions, for example. But let's think this through. Let's assume for a minute that all of us listening here could agree that we should censor information. And first of all, of course, not all of us will ever agree to that, but let's assume we did. Then we have to agree on what should be censored. Should we be censoring opinions about COVID? Should we be censoring hate speech? Probably we'd never exactly agree on what should and shouldn't be censored, but let's assume for a minute that we did. Once we agree, for example, that hate speech should be censored, now we have to define exactly what that is and how we're going to feed it to the model. So let's say we take 100,000 random social media postings. We have to agree on exactly which, say, 1,000 were in fact hate speech and which of the others were not. Again, we'd never be able to agree 100% on that, but let's assume we did. Now we have to build a model to separate those two groups. As all of us in the industry know, no model will be perfect, and we're going to have to make a choice. Are we conservative with our model, meaning that we want to make sure no hate speech gets through, therefore we'll be willing to censor a lot of non-hate speech things to block the hate speech, or we'll be more liberal with the model, meaning that we don't want to censor anything that shouldn't be, and that will enable some hate speech to get through. Again, we could probably never agree on exactly where those lines are. So when you start to go down the path of saying that censorship is a good thing, even if you agree with that premise, it's almost never going to be possible to get people as a whole to agree to where those lines should be. So I'll just offer up one alternative in this specific case, which is we can build filters and flags for any kind of speech. Why not have a social media platform say, I want to censor anything deemed hate speech by a tight filter or a loose filter. I want to censor any medical opinion that is or isn't from the World Health Organization. I don't like cats. I want to censor any tweet or posting that talks about my connections cats. I don't want to hear any politics for the next month. Whatever the case is, you could enable people to self-censor to their own tastes and their own beliefs rather than forcing it on us. But this is a big issue that's only going to grow is, do we really want what ends up being potentially, faceless data scientists in Silicon Valley deciding what you or I are allowed to even see? So let's assume we've decided we have a good target, that we should in fact build the models we're talking about. Our next question is, what data is okay to feed into those models? And this again gets murky. So let's start with an example. One of the key challenges with any kind of model or forecast is that we are virtually always using past data in order to predict the future. And what that means is we will perpetuate the patterns in that data. So this gets to scenarios such as, you read about algorithms helping judges sentence. It'll say, historically speaking, in the last decade, if someone's getting their third marijuana possession conviction in 5 years, this was a typical sentence. And that's great. It can actually help consistency. However, it makes a really important assumption, which is that the way we punished marijuana possession in the past is how we want to punish it today. And as we know in that example, marijuana laws and opinions towards it have changed very rapidly in the past few years. And it's very likely that in many states and many jurisdictions as well, you would be punished less harshly today for marijuana by popular opinion and also by some of the legalities than you would historically. So to use a model with all that historical data is going to over-punish people. Another example, think about college admissions. When you look at the last 10 or 20 years of who was admitted, what did they look like, and were they successful? When you apply that to this year's batch of candidates, you're inherently assuming that whatever it took in order to succeed years ago is still what it took to, or will take to succeed in this upcoming year. And that may be a valid assumption, but maybe it's not. And the core point here is that you really have to examine that and make sure that that data is representative, or do you need to actually think about different data? And the bias can be very, very hard to detect. You might not even be aware that your data has a bias unless you do some back-end diagnostics. This is a great example you can find out on the web about a study that looked at wild wolves and husky dogs and was able to differentiate the two at an incredibly highly successful rate, even though they look somewhat similar. What they did then was a bunch of diagnostics, and I'll talk about this method in a little bit, to say, what is it in the images that's actually doing the differentiation? And they were shocked to find it had nothing to do with how the dogs looked. What happened was there was a built-in bias in that wild wolves were often snapshotted in the wild with snow behind them in cold environments, and huskies were obviously shot on a living room couch or standing in a kitchen. And so the algorithm had honed in on the fact that if there was snow in the background, it was almost certainly a wolf, and that was a very good predictor. However, that was a secondary component. It really has nothing to do with actually differentiating a wolf from a husky. And then we get into the discussion of who even owns data. This is an absolute difficult question. And today, unfortunately, you need to make sure that all of your legal contracts specify who has access. So let's go through one scenario that's very common. Let's talk about sensors in an airplane engine. So you might have Rolls-Royce, who manufactures engines, who puts a bunch of sensors in them. They could very reasonably say, we're manufacturing these engines, we have a responsibility to make sure that they're safe, that they operate properly, etc. We should have access to all the sensor data from every one of our engines that ever is put out there. Okay, fair enough. Now, you could have an airplane manufacturer like Boeing or Airbus. They could say very reasonably, hey, we put these engines on our airplane. We're responsible for that whole aircraft, how it's performing, its safety. We need all the data from those sensors. Fair enough. You could have an airline like Delta, United, American Airlines make the same claim. Hey, there are airplanes in our fleet. We're on the hook for maintaining them. We're on the hook for making sure that we follow safety. We should have access to the data. And then you could have the FAA step in and say the same thing. We're in charge of safety over the entire airline network. We have to have access to that data. So I'll just pause there and say there's 4 totally different constituencies that all have on the surface an incredibly reasonable claim on having access to that sensor data for analysis purposes. Which of them do and to what extent? The answer is who knows? Because legally there's not a set standard for that. It's all in the details of how they've all written their contracts as those engines move through the supply chain. Even at that, to the extent you have access to the data, there's certain uses I think we could easily argue would be unethical. So it wouldn't really be ethical for one airline to try and do analysis of the repair quality at different airports with the goal of finding an airport that's a competitor's hub that's worse at maintenance to then market that difference and claim that your airline's safer. It also wouldn't really be proper for the FAA to do an analysis of differences between airlines and then sell that to airlines to go market against each other. So even to the extent that you had access to that data, certainly there'd be limits in terms of the fair use. And again, in today's world, you've got to be thinking this through from the get-go. There is no 100% set standard, and so you've got to take it upon yourself and your organization to actually make that happen. So let's say, for the argument's sake, you know your model's fair. You also now know that your data is good. Now we've got to have transparency and effective monitoring of those models to stay within ethical bounds. So we all know things like deep learning and AI, natural language processing, they're very opaque, meaning unlike traditional statistical models, it's very hard to differentiate or deduce exactly what's happening underneath the hood. Classic regression models, I can find out exactly what the parameter associated with any given factor is. I can find its margin of error, what percentage of variance it explains. And in fact, that's used as a legal justification for models in cases like credit scoring. In the world of deep learning and AI today, that's not necessarily possible. And so you get into a question. Where is it okay to have a model that's unexplainable and where is it not? Again, if I'm building models to give me a couple of offers on a cash register receipt, I don't really care how they're generated. If in fact customers are redeeming them and seem to like them and I'm not getting many complaints, we can probably go with that. If I'm analyzing x-rays in order to make a diagnosis of cancer, probably we're not going to be comfortable just knowing that somehow it magically works, because we always have in the back of our mind, is it a scenario like those husky dogs a little bit ago where it's a red herring that's actually causing it. So it really depends on the situation. But luckily, there's a lot of work going on in this area towards making these more understandable. And this is part of what was used underneath identifying the problem with the husky versus wolves. It's called LIME, Locally Interpretable Model Agnostic Explanations. And what it does on the back end of a deep learning algorithm to recognize an image, in this case of a tree frog, it comes back on the left there, the probability of that image being a tree frog is just over 54, just about 54%. What LIME does is it will take that image and randomly black out parts of it, as you can see down the middle, and rescore it. and do that again and again, and you're back to, again, thousands or millions of iterations, just like you do on the front end to build a scoring model, you can then look at the probabilities associated with each subcomponent of the image and come up then at the end on the bottom right with a weighted average that'll say, here are the things in this image that most influence whether it's a tree frog. In this case, kind of the nose and the eye socket, which makes some sense. I might be comfortable with this model. Point is, this is a powerful way to start to understand what is and isn't happening underneath the hood. Now, the interesting thing here is I think in time, we might be able to have even government regulations that will say if you use a certain type of line with a certain minimum number of iterations and so forth, that there will be an acceptable use of a model. We're not there yet. But another interesting fact to keep in mind is that if you notice, part of the definition of Lime is model agnostic. While this is getting a lot of legs underneath AI, it's not specific to AI at all. It can reverse engineer any given algorithm. And so if there was a classic logistic regression predicting whether I should or shouldn't be approved for a insurance policy on the web, if you did not have a bot detector, I could sit and slightly change my age, my income, my home value, et cetera, again and again and again, pass it into a process like this and effectively reverse engineer that traditional model as well. These are some really cool things that people are working on. And then last, I'll use an example of, when you automate things that are making decisions, you have risk that comes with that, but also responsibility to manage that risk. And one of the cases, most expensive cases where this type of thing went haywire was back in the flash crash of 2010, where for a short period during a trading day, some stocks got sent all the way down to effectively zero or 1 penny due to some computerized trading algorithms that went haywire. So in this case, this is Accenture. And I always point out Accenture was completely innocent here. They had nothing to do with this. They're one of many stocks who happened to get hit. It's just one I found a graph of. The bottom left, you'll see a long, thin rectangle with a dark line in the middle. This screenshots from the dark line. The high price of the day was $40. In the middle of your screen up top, you see 33 right now. The bottom right, you'll see a minimum price of 1 penny. What happened was these computerized trading algorithms went haywire, played off each other, and bidded down a variety of stocks to virtually worthless for a short period of time. Caused a lot of pain, a lot of mayhem. The stock market went back, reversed a lot of trades, both profitable and unprofitable, because it wasn't really a fair scenario. And computerized algorithms got a huge black eye, which led to a lot of people to claim that computerized trading algorithms would go out of favor based on this pain. And in fact, they did. There was so much money being made overall that while this was painful, it was a cost of doing business. And what they did, they realized we need to have more checks, both within the code itself. The algorithms needed more self-checks to identify when the algorithm could tell it was going off the rails and shut itself off. Also, you're in need of better manual policies with someone sitting and watching and able to hit a manual stop button, much like in a manufacturing facility, to force this process to stop if it appears to be going off the rails. Both those are better in place today, certainly, and we haven't had a repeat of this. But this is something you always have to think about. When you automate something and you deploy it, you've got to take seriously that risk, and you need both automated as well as manual checks. So let's go to this next section now. Now we've got our model target. The data's okay. We know how to monitor it. Now we got to talk about usage. And this gets interesting because we build a model in one environment using one set of data for one purpose. It does not mean that it's valid and ethical to use it in others. So let's go through a couple examples. I like to say that context is critical. I personally think the world of AI, while we focus today on it, on the opaqueness of it, et cetera, there are some paths to solving that, like Lime. I think the hardest part by far is going to be coding the context and the exceptions. So I spent many years hands-on coding all day, every day. And I used to always say that I felt like it took me about 10% of my time to code my process to do exactly what I wanted it to do when everything was perfect. It then took 90% of my time to error-proof and idiot-proof that same set of code. In other words, to account for every way that bad data could be fed to my process, or every inappropriate way that someone might interact with the process. That was much harder. I think it's going to be same here. So if you take a look at this picture, you could train a bunch of AI processes to identify it's two women, they're playing tennis, the one has on a visor. So here's one I would do a live quiz if I was with you. I would say, by a show of hands, how many people think that woman in front is about to hit the tennis ball? Typically, half or more of the audience will raise their hand. Then I'll say, well, how many of you think she's just about to hit the tennis ball rather than just hit it? And most of the rest will raise their hand. And then everyone will look around, think about it and go, wait, something's off here. And they're exactly right. Here's the point. Both of you ostensibly are correct. She either just hit the ball or is just about to hit the ball. One of those two answers is right, but we understand in context that they cannot possibly both be right. And in order to solve the problem, we would need 2 consecutive frames of video where the ball is getting closer to or further from the racket and we have our answer. In a classic AI case, you could have one model trained to identify, did someone just hit a ball? This probably shows up 99%. You have another one trained, is someone about to hit a ball? This will show up 99%. Both those algorithms will confidently put out their 99% prediction, neither of them having a clue that together they're giving an impossible scenario. So they're both extremely confident at 99 plus, and they're both 100% wrong joint. That's incredibly difficult to think of all of those different scenarios where you have to account for what exceptions and what context. So think through that. And one example of this, there was a lot of debate last year about whether this Google Duplex chatbot passed the Turing test because it was able to interact with people to make dinner reservations without the people realizing they were talking to a robot. So first of all, there are ethical issues around should you even be having a robot talk to people without them knowing it. Let's set that aside. Here's the catch. The scope of the conversation around getting a reservation is very, very narrow. You could almost do it with a basic decision tree to begin with. So I ask for a time. Can you get me a reservation at 7 tonight? The typical responses are, no, but I can get you in at either 5:30 or 8:30, or I can get you in tomorrow night at 7. Would you like me to book one of those? And then I can say yes or no. And the duplex would do fine in that scenario. But now imagine a slightly different answer. The chatbot asks, can I get a reservation for 7 o'clock tomorrow night? And the hostess says, well, you can, but are you going to be coming from the east or the west? If you're coming from the west, you'll be fine. If you're coming from the east, keep in mind that there's a big game at the stadium, and we typically find it's going to take an extra 30 to 45 minutes for you to get through the traffic to actually get here. Do you still want to come at 7 o'clock tomorrow night? There's no way that the chatbot's going to know how to handle that. So back to the context, at minimum, that chatbot has to understand when it's heard something that it doesn't get and kick it back to a person. The other thing is not to let exceptions drive the rules. Back to everything from the censorship algorithms to predicting who will succeed in college to what offers are going to work. The fact is, every model gets some things wrong. We don't know which things will get wrong until we actually see them in operation, but no model's perfect. And so what we cannot do is sit there and let those exceptions guide all of our decisions. So let me give you a real world example that's very close to home. When I was in high school, a good friend of mine got T-boned when a car ran a stop sign or red light at about 40 miles an hour. Now, the interesting thing was she was not wearing a seatbelt. She saw this car coming at her at the last instant and threw herself towards the passenger side. She got banged up a little bit, but actually nothing too serious. The police officer at the scene actually told her, you're lucky you didn't have on your seatbelt. Had you had on your seatbelt, you wouldn't have been able to throw yourself to the passenger side and you would have been killed, certainly. So here I have an example of a friend of mine unequivocally saved for not wearing a seatbelt. Furthermore, I can virtually guarantee you I could find hundreds or thousands of incidences in the U.S. alone every year where someone was saved because they did not wear a seatbelt. So I could then, in theory, go start a national movement to ban seatbelts. Now we can rename them death belts for these purposes. And I can go to Capitol Hill, get dozens of death belt survivors on the steps talking about how they're only alive today because they refused to put on the death belt, and they'd be dead if they hadn't, including some children. Now, you all think that sounds crazy, and in fact, 99% of people would agree. And the reason is we go, well, yeah, but Bill, you're not accounting for the fact that seatbelts save a lot more lives. For every person you can bring to the Capitol claiming they were alive because they didn't wear a seatbelt, we could probably find 10 who are only alive because they did. And that's also true. So this is where we make decisions in society all the time about the net gains. We accept some people will die from wearing a seatbelt. That's a given, but we agree many more will be saved because of wearing it. These are the kind of decisions and difficult ones we have to make. And so, for example, with autonomous vehicles, we can't allow every time an autonomous vehicle has a wreck, all the calls for banning autonomous vehicles, or we'll never get anywhere. We have to be willing to look at a measure like every 100,000 miles driven, autonomous vehicles, they will have wrecks, but it's at X%. And if humans are higher than X, that's a good trade-off, albeit it's very unfortunate for those of us who are on the losing side. We'll have some very similar decisions to make as a society very soon here with this whole COVID crisis. At some point, we're making decisions of either people dying because they're being locked down or people dying because they go out of lockdown too early. And there's no easy answers. But at the end of the day, we have to face those uncomfortable questions. So let's finish then. Even if you have the model usage, we have to then define policies to help us through all of this. And the problem is this can get very, very dicey. I saw a CEO of a hospital chain speaking, and he mentioned how terrified they were of having DNA data in their systems. He said, you know, it's one thing to get a credit card stolen, or even to some degree a social security number. There's ways to get a new social security number or block it, but he goes, DNA is the essence of who people are, and it's even that much more sensitive. So if we get hacked and we lose DNA data, gosh knows the liability that we have. So he wasn't comfortable having it there to begin with. But then he said, so now what happens as new technologies and procedures become available where we might be able to say, a new test has come up. If we run a person's DNA through it, we can tell them with a high degree of certainty that they're going to die by the time they're 60 from a congenital disease that we cannot fix. He said, so what happens now? Do we have an ethical responsibility to go and alert every patient whose DNA we have that we have that test and give them the opportunity to have it? Or do we wait for people to come to us? And he said, so here's how this plays out, because the laws haven't caught up. If we tell everybody this test exists, then someone goes and gets the test, finds out they're going to die, they burn through their savings, they end up on drugs, they ruin their family relationships. He said, that family can come and sue us and say, look, our family, we never asked you to solicit this test to our loved one. If you had never mentioned it to them, they never would have known. Everything would have been fine, and it would have been far better off. On the flip side, let's say they knew about the test and they don't alert everybody. Somebody else dies, they didn't have their affairs in order, they didn't take care of things they otherwise would. He said, I can see that family suing and now saying, you knew that you had a test. And our family members certainly would have taken you up on it had you alerted them. They would have had their affairs in order and avoided all this mess that we're in. He said, unfortunately, with the way the laws are today, I could see that we would go into court and lose both of those cases, even though they're polar opposite. We're getting sued for acknowledging the test exists in one case and for not acknowledging it in another. So his solution was, we're just going to stop offering to store DNA data. Once a treatment path is done, we're going to delete it. So from a risk mitigation and a business management perspective, I get it. It's a safe thing to do, but as a society, it's not necessarily the path that we think is ideal to go down. And you can go too far as well. A friend who works in the fashion industry, and obviously a big cost there is returns when people get clothes that don't quite fit. So, you know, they're always asking their customers, who are predominantly women, to send in their measurements and so forth and their sizes so that they can make sure things fit. But they still had a lot of trouble. So they came up with this great idea, which from a data and analytics perspective is awesome. A very tight bodysuit. I picture something like, one of these latex scuba type suits you see here. And where all those lights are on this one, imagine sensors that are going to measure every possible aspect of the wearer's body. So from a data perspective, this would be awesome data to have. You could definitely fit the women's clothing better. However, when they actually did the prototype of this and sent it around to customers, two things. First of all, a lot of women were just saying, there's no way I'm putting this on my body and giving you all of these detailed measurements. And then secondarily, of course, then they think, well, who else has had on this suit? That's nasty, and they're not going to wear it. So the whole thing fell apart. They went back to asking for self-reported data and getting a little more specific, as well as looking at what was returned and what wasn't. But this is a case where it's a little bit of variation. What will customers find acceptable? Again, ethical to ask for this, but you're going to drive customers a little too far. It's bad policy. And last, one of the things I'd say is most important is to take a stand. Let people know what you believe, regardless of where your ethical lines are. So one example here from a few years ago was Apple. If you recall, there was a terrorist attack in LA, and the government came back and issued a request to Apple to unlock, quote, just this one phone this one time. Apple went back and deliberated and said, well, two things. First, we've staked our entire reputation on being secure encrypted platform for our customers, and this would violate that. Second, we don't believe for an instant it'll be this one phone this one time. Once we enable it once, there'll be the next phone the next time, then it'll be 100 phones a month, and then it's ubiquitous, and hackers may eventually get access to these routines. So they refuse to do it. So here's the point. Some of you on this phone were probably furious at Apple for that. Some were probably thrilled with Apple. The point here isn't to judge whether Apple was right or wrong, but what I will say is this: whether you agree or disagree with them, I would hope you would agree it's better that you know where they stand. Wouldn't you rather do business with a company knowing where they stand in a situation like this? So in this case, I would say they probably lost some customers and they probably gained some customers from that stand. But in both those cases, people were more certain about their desire to do business with Apple. So by taking those stands, whatever they are, and making them public, it can actually help you be differentiated. And I think we're going to start to see companies differentiate more on ethical practices. And we're already starting to see this. Things like the DuckDuckGo search engine, which doesn't track. It doesn't claim to be a better search engine than a Google, for example. It just claims to be much more private and ethical in data, and that is appealing to some people. So we've gone through these 5 checkpoints across the entire spectrum, everywhere from as you're defining your problem, grabbing your data, setting up your monitoring processes, making sure you're using things appropriately, and you've accounted for all of the context and exceptions, and then defining policies. So let's wrap up with a few final thoughts for you on how can you take action from today. So first, if it's not clear, laws and public opinion have to catch up with what's possible today. Laws are hopelessly out of date. There's a lot of things that are legal simply because no one's thought to even address it, but that are completely unethical. You've got to be careful. One way to do that is set up an ethics review board. This is something borrowed from academia and research worlds, where if you're going to harm potentially an animal or a person, either mentally or physically, you've got to go in front of a review board, describe your experiment, what the benefits of the experiment should be, and why the potential harm is both unlikely and not so bad. And you have to get that approved. Now, you don't necessarily have to be as formal as they are, but imagine just having a cross-functional team, include somebody from legal, somebody from HR, somebody from sales, obviously representation from IT, and representation from the data science analytics organization, broad spectrum, who review major new uses of data or major new analytic processes and decide this is in fact ethical. From our perspective, you have our blessing, and then document that. It can be powerful. Because the most important step to being ethical with analytics is what I call intentionality. You have to be intentional about forcing people to think about this every day. People simply don't think about it every day unless they are forced to try. Think of how many people will acknowledge that healthy diet and exercise are important and good to do, but then will admit freely that they really don't do it because they've never taken the discipline to force themselves to try and eat healthier every day and to try and exercise every day. Ethics is similar. We're all very busy. If you're not forcing yourself and others to think about it, intentionally you won't. So for example, in addition to the review board, I like to recommend any project charter documents you have, you ought to add a section on ethical considerations, where in addition to what data are we going to use, what problem are we solving, you ought to have to write up, and here are the potential ethical issues, if any, on this project. It forces people to think through it. You ought to have people talking about this, and you also need to have the equivalent of the hotline. People ought to be able to raise ethical concerns anonymously, and while if a concern is serious, there ought to be a process then to halt certainly the deployment of, if not the production of, a new process that has those concerns. But you've got to make it front and center. You've got to talk about it from the interview point to each project to ongoing training. You can't just say, until legal has an opinion, we're going to do whatever we need to. And you can't just say, we'll leave it up to our people to do what's right. Because as we've seen, there's so much gray area. Even if they're doing their best to do it right, everyone's going to have a different line. So what you have to think about then, ethics is everyone's responsibility in the analytics and data science community. It's yours, it's your team's. It's not the legal departments. It's not Congress. It is yours. You're the one creating these analytics. You're the one manipulating this and collecting this data. You've got to take responsibility for the ethics. You may not do it perfectly, but as long as you document it and you have some written policies, if you're enforcing those, if you can show you have a review board, if you do end up in the news because of some questionable practices, or you do end up with a lawsuit, you're going to be in a lot better place, both public opinion-wise and legally, when you're showing that you took true due diligence, certainly beyond the current industry standard, to try and do the right thing for the right reasons, and that you had checks and balances in place. Both public opinion and a court of law will be much more forgiving, but it's on you, and I encourage all of you and your teams to take that seriously. So steps you can take today. Obviously, make ethics a priority every day within your organization. You can no longer let this go. Absolutely set up that cross-functional ethical review board. Make sure your entire organization from the top down is aware of the decisions that are being made and make them get on board. Develop those written ethical guidelines and take the violations seriously. The reality is, like with anything else, some violations might be a slap on the wrist, others you might get fired, and some you could actually get sent to prison for. Point is, if you don't have those guidelines, it's going to be even harder for people to do it, but it's worth that effort. And the goal of all this is to aim for that transparency and fairness. Your goal is to be transparent in what you're doing, to do your best to be fair. There's zero doubt that whatever decisions you make today, some of them in retrospect will be viewed as either wrong or non-optimal at best. And you, as long as you're learning and you're trying to evolve it, again, that's better than putting your head in the sand and doing nothing. And last, I always say, put yourself in the shoes of whoever's data or information is being analyzed or whoever those scores or outputs are being used on behalf of. If you're not comfortable with it, that's a serious red flag and you really need to dig deeper. But I also caution you, just because you personally are comfortable with it, that is not a green light, because you could have a different opinion than others. You still have to go back to those policies and your peers and that review board and make sure that everything's okay. So with that, I wish you all the best of luck with your ethics. If you have any other questions later beyond today, my contact information is there on the screen, as well as my website. You're welcome to reach out at any point in time. And with that, I'll thank you all again for having joined today for this virtual session, and I'll look forward to the Q&A in just a few minutes. Thank you very much.